It seems strange to come to a university and put PhD on my slides, but in the finance world, that's weird, so I put it up there. Okay, I work for Fidelity Digital Assets. Just a couple words about that. Our lawyers made us say this. So Fidelity Digital Assets is a new business unit that we are custodying Bitcoin and hopefully Ether soon for institutional customers. So we have a whole wallet infrastructure to hold Bitcoin, and obviously protection of those assets is paramount, right? Well, you know, Fidelity is a large company, about $7 trillion assets under management, and we may end up having a whole lot of Bitcoin under custody, and it would be really, really bad to lose it. But exchanges get hacked all the time, and we want to do everything we possibly can to protect that. So in that vein, a couple of years ago, this topic got kicked off by Eamon Gunsayer and some of his postdocs and grad students at Cornell. They wrote a paper called Bitcoin Covenants, which describes a mechanism to do what I'm about to discuss. And there are 4 other ideas to do this. So let's start out and let me just first describe what is the basic idea we're talking about here. So on-chain defense in depth. That is, we're going to do some things on the blockchain that will prevent other people from making transactions on the blockchain. And the way we do that is what's called a vault. So a vaulted Bitcoin transaction has 2 phases in 2 transactions. So the first is you send your Bitcoins to a vaulted address, BC1 vault, so I'm using the new BC1 addresses. And then once it's in the vault, in order to spend it, you first have to unlock it, right? So this address actually has a time lock on it and an extra encumbrance that prevents people from stealing it directly from that address, even if they have the private keys. This unlock transaction takes some time, right? So you start from the vault. So Alice, a customer, deposits to the vault, then it sits there for some time. And when you're ready to send it out to Bob over here, you send this unlock transaction. You have to wait out some time. But during that time, you have another option here with a different set of keys to send the funds back to your vault. The idea here is that if a thief gets into your system and steals your private keys, which is basically the worst case scenario, right? They manage to get in, exfiltrate the private keys, at which point they can do anything they want. This prevents them from actually doing anything for this timeout, right? So let's say this is 12 hours here. So in other words, if you put in a withdrawal request, we are not going to be able to satisfy that withdrawal request for, let's say, 12 hours. So that's pretty standard procedure in financial services to have a wait between the time you submit a request for withdrawal and it actually being executed. And that wait gives us a time during which we can see a thief trying to do the same thing. So basically what we're doing is we're watching the blockchain. We're looking for a thief to spend this transaction from the vault to the unlock. And if we see that in a way that we did not create, we know something's going on. And we can take action. And that action we take is we take those funds, we send them back to another address that we control. So that's the basic picture. This alternative spending mechanism we call a clawback. This is an alternative to sending them to Bob. So an example of how this would work. So we have, is there a laser pointer over here, by the way? All right, I'll use my finger. So an example of how to do this. So one example would be if this unlocked transaction looks like this. So this is a pay to script hash type transaction, and you have this script in here, and your address is just a hash of this, right? So I've got an if-else statement. So the normal course of execution is there is a time lock here, 72 blocks, it's about 12 hours. So first of all, we're going to check that this lock time has passed. And second of all, we're going to have, let's say, a 2 of 2 multisig. So during the course of a normal withdrawal, we would wait out this 12 hours, and then we would use this multisig here and send it on to the customer requesting the withdrawal. This else statement here is the clawback, right? So there's a separate set of keys here, which are controlled separately. So the idea is the thief is able to steal these 2 pub keys, but did not steal these 2 pub keys, or private keys, rather. And if that happens, if the thief steals these 2 private keys, but not these 2, then I can use this else condition, and the thief cannot. And using this else condition, there is no time lock here. And that's and then I can send it to another address. By not having a time lock here, this gives me this time window, 72 blocks, where I don't have a race condition with the thief, right? So there's another way to do this, and that is that if a thief sends a transaction, there's 10 minutes before it gets mined roughly, I could play a game where I try and double spend him during that 10 minutes. But then I'm in a race. And I want to avoid that race. So the time lock here actually prevents the race, because I have control during that 72 hours and the thief does not. So the challenge with doing this, so this if-else statement is fairly straightforward, but the challenge of doing this is that you want to enforce that this vaulted address can only spend to the unlocked address that we control. There are 2 transactions and 2 addresses here, and they're tied together. So I have to somehow enforce that the next transaction that comes from this one has to go to this specific address. And that's the hard part. So we generally can't do that in Bitcoin today. But if you could, you can prevent immediate theft via stealing the hot or cold private keys. This form of encumbrance was termed a covenant by Eamon Gunsayer and his collaborators. Okay, so some features of this whole mechanism. So the remainder of this talk is going to be dedicated to discussing several possibilities for achieving this mechanism. Come on in, guys. Grab a seat. So some features of this mechanism. This transaction that sends your funds from a vault to this unlocked address effectively starts a clock, right? We want to enforce a clock. And the reason it needs 2 transactions is because we're actually using the blockchain as a clock. The first transaction gets mined into a block. There's a timestamp in that block. And then I have the blockchain via a relative time lock is actually counting the number of blocks that come after. And that is where the enforcement comes in. I don't know when the thief is going to steal the funds. And I don't know when to start this clock. So that's why it requires 2 transactions. That first transaction starts the clock.
Now maybe I'm just rolling this back a bit, but what is the, I'm a bit hazy on what the scenario is, what the threat scenario is.
So the threat scenario.
The threat in some detail?
Yeah. So the threat is, so I have a cold storage. Thief somehow manages to exfiltrate my private keys, right? Which normally means game over, all funds lost, right? And so this is a mechanism to actually save yourself in that situation. Now, how they exfiltrate those private keys is subject to exactly how your wallet is built. And I'm not going to get into the detail of how we built our wallet or anything like that. But
So the threat is simple disclosure, simple capture of private keys?
Yeah, basically. And it doesn't matter how they obtain them, right? There are side channel attacks, there are insider threat attacks, there are signature vulnerability attacks. There are certain circumstances where if you can convince somebody to sign a message that reuses this nonce K in ECDSA, you can actually compute the private key. Multiple ways you could potentially get the private key if there was some flaw in the software.
Do you have any statistics on this?
Not in this talk, but there have been hundreds upon hundreds of exchange hacks, right? It's estimated 20% of all Bitcoin in existence has been stolen. I'm making that number off the top of my head. Probably wrong about it, but it's large. And we just had last week this Quadriga CX exchange in Canada. Shut down, $100 million, either lost or stolen by the founder. Nobody knows yet.
So is there a reason for focusing upon working around these sort of foundational limitations in the security of the keys of the system, and focus upon this sort of workaround?
As opposed to?
As opposed to re-architecting the mechanisms by which keys are used and making them more consistent with the ways that the keys are used in cryptography more generally.
So the idea here is defense in depth, right? So do both. This talk is focusing on what can I do on the blockchain, right? You can do a lot of things off the blockchain too, right? I can smear shard my keys. I can use MPC to compute the signature. I can do all kinds of stuff. And we use a lot of those tools. But that has had a lot of focus around the industry. This has not, and this by and large is not practical today on Bitcoin. It will require changes to Bitcoin. And so the purpose of this talk is really to get people thinking about this scenario. And if we want to implement these changes in Bitcoin, exactly which changes do we want to implement and why? Because these would be soft fork changes. There's probably going to be a soft fork coming this summer that's going to include several of the things I'm going to talk about in the rest of the talk. I would very much like there to be a mechanism in there such that we could use vaults. It's a tricky question. And honestly, this talk does not really have much of a conclusion. I'm going to present to you several alternatives, and I hope to just raise people's awareness, think about it, and over the next few months, hopefully we'll discuss it, and maybe we'll get this into a soft fork sometime soon. Or maybe it's just a terrible idea and we just shouldn't do it at all. Yeah.
Just to raise awareness about how other case where this could be really useful is whenever we are generating a state channel between two parties and you want to close that state channel, maybe it's more profitable for you to close it not in the latest transaction but in an earlier transaction. If a system like this is not in place, we wouldn't be protected against that. If a system like this would be working, then you would start claiming that you want to close that channel, and then there will be a period through which I could call, if I have an earlier proof that we did an earlier transaction, I could execute a clawback and recover the money because you were trying to cheat on me. So these systems are also needed for not only for security as is for private keys, which is, as you said, in-depth security is important, but also for operation and in second layer scalability as well.
So on that point,
That's a different fact.
I think that's
so on that point, so this is also used for lightning channels. This basic structure is used in lightning channels too, where I have an if-else and one of the branches has a time lock. The way I'm using it here is actually backwards compared to the way it's done in lightning and plasma and other state channel approaches. The one with the time lock is the normal execution branch, right? In lightning or plasma, the one without the time lock is the normal execution branch, and this is your fail-safe. This is the what's called the adversarial close of the channel, the one with the time lock. So it's similar construct, but and similar use of features. I don't quite know off the top of my head how to incorporate this with state channels because of that flip, but we can discuss it afterwards. Okay, so yes, so all right, so the blockchain is a clock, enforces this policy. It starts when the thief executes his theft attempt. We see it, we know about it because we have other nodes watching the blockchain that are not connected to the system from which he stole it, and we can detect that this happens. This really requires an online approach. It's appropriate for service providers and institutions, exchanges, things like that. Not really appropriate for your personal cold storage because you're probably not going to set up a watching node just to see that this is happening. This alternative spend we're calling a clawback, just terminology here. Vaults, clawbacks, and covenants are the kind of terminology here. You have the opportunity to watch the blockchain for your own address and see the unvaulting you didn't create. Then you have this time lock time to pull out these clawback keys. So one thing of note here, this set of clawback keys is a different set of keys than the one the thief stole. And presumably they're more difficult to access than the ones the thief stole. So these might be cold keys. It might even be a bigger multisig than your cold keys. And the idea is they stole your hot keys or even your cold keys. And these ones, the clawback keys should be more secure because they're used less often. They're not used in the course of normal operations. And so that makes them more difficult to discover by an attacker. An attacker who is capable of watching your operation or hacks into your system and can see how things move through the system can discover where the keys are located or who has control of them, and then mount their attack against those people or against those systems. But the clawback keys should not be used, right? Until you have to execute this clawback mechanism. And if you saw a theft attempt like this, you probably want to shut down your system for a few days and figure out what the heck happened. And not use that mechanism in exactly the same way again. So, last point here, the clawback wallet, the destination of the funds, when I execute this clawback mechanism, needs to be different than the original one. Because the assumption here is the thief has stolen my cold wallet keys. And maybe he's stolen other things I don't even know about. But the idea is I would have to set up a backup wallet, essentially, that would be the target of the funds send when I execute clawback to try and save the funds from the thief. So the rest of this talk, I'm going to dig into some rather specific technical details of how to do this. But let me just pause here for a few minutes and ask if there are any questions about the general mechanism.
So actually it sounds quite similar to the time period between a transaction taking place in a bank account and settlement. during which time you can
Absolutely.
undo. And
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, one way I like to think about this is that those kind of time locks are present all over finance. And the way they're implemented is really, there's a computer system that looks at the time on the clock and says, all right, the time hasn't passed yet. These systems are not cryptographically secure. If I hack into the right system and I can twiddle the right bit in the right system, I can convince you the time is different than it actually is. And I can completely evade those kind of controls. The notion of time lock itself, is very old. Back in the Old West, they would have this, physical mechanical clocks where the bank vault owner would leave for the night and go home, and he would set the timer on the vault such that the vault wouldn't open overnight while he wasn't there. It would only open at 8 a.m. the next morning. This is like a physical time lock. I actually have a photo of it in the blog post I wrote about this a while back. But yeah, this is standard practice, right? You want to insert various time gaps in the right places for security measures and authorization control in your system.
Do
Yeah.
you have control over how many days or how much time elapsed?
Of course.
Like if I said I wanted it to be 72 hours and you said you wanted it to be 12 hours, so that's a little bit different than the banks too, because the banks has usually a settlement time in between.
The time here is set by the service provider, right? So all these transactions are created and controlled by the service provider. This service provider is providing a service to the customers who are trusting them with their funds. Whether this is an exchange or it's a custodian or something else. All of this, everything that's happening here is set by the service provider. And if you want those times to be different, that's a negotiation with your customer. And you can make the time really short, but then it's higher risk, and then you're going to have to ask about your insurance, and et cetera, et cetera. Yeah.
So, could theoretically miners, by reducing their mining power, affect the time lock? Since
No.
it's not measured in blocks,
It is.
then they could stop mining and the average time for a block would increase a lot for a period of time. Therefore,
So there are two ways to specify time locks. This mechanism I said here is check lock time verify. This is a relative time lock. There is also so this is a relative time lock specified in a number of blocks. There is also a time lock so there are basically four forms of time lock depending on how you count. You've got relative, absolute, block-based, or clock-based. So by how you encode this number here, you can select all of those options. So here I'm using a relative time lock. In this example, I use number of blocks, but I can also choose to go by the clock. So I can say,
we go by the clock, or are we taking that number from? Is it from the block?
that number comes from the miners putting the timestamp in the block header. So yes, if miners want to mess with this, they could. But that is basically your standard 51% attack, right? So nothing in Bitcoin works if you have a 51% attack.
But it could affect it to a lesser degree without a 51% attack. It's just 30% of the
If you wanted to speed up or slow down the time lock,
speeding up is harder,
yeah.
And I guess that's the harder, that's what they would want to do. And that's,
You could, yeah. If you're a miner, you could slow it down by turning things off. Presumably, you want to turn things on, and you can calculate, the cost of doing that. So today, at whatever the hash rate is, in 2017, it was approximately $4 billion spent on Bitcoin mining total, right? And if I divide that by the number of blocks within 2017, I can calculate roughly how much each block is worth. And I can say, okay, the value of this transaction is, $10 million, right? And the cost of an attack is X number of dollars, right? And so what I can do is then set this time lock based upon the ratio of those two numbers, right? The cost of a mining attack versus the value of this transfer. And what that means is that high value transfers will have longer time locks, which is frankly, a very good risk strategy that I haven't seen anybody in the Bitcoin space attempt, but it would be a very good idea if different value transfers had different confirmation times, essentially. And that confirmation time is showing up here in this parameter, which is a risk parameter.
So you said there's a need for soft fork to allow some functionality. So what is the functionality?
That's the rest of the talk.
Oh.
Okay, so there are four mechanisms I know of that have been proposed to do this. So first of all, Ite Eyal, Imgun Sayer, and Moser wrote this paper in 2016 at Financial Bitcoin. on what they call Bitcoin covenants, and they proposed this new opcode called check output verify. The second mechanism is one that I came up with. A few months after that, I wrote a blog post describing a way to do this using pre-signed transactions. And that allows you to basically do this mechanism without actually modifying Bitcoin. So I'll talk mostly about that one because it was my idea and I know most about it. Johnson Lau a few years ago put out a BIP which never really went anywhere called push TX data, which essentially lets you take pieces of the transaction and put them on the stack and do computation with them. And the last idea was recently published by Russell O'Connor, and they had a paper in Financial Cryptos 2017. Now this mechanism essentially adds an opcode called check sig from stack, which literally checks a signature from the stack. And there's a trick by which you can use that to implement a covenant. So I'm going to go through these one by one. So the first one is this opt check put output verify. And as the name implies, what it does is it examines a specific output and does computation on it. It's sort of like a regular expression. So I put a template, a transaction template, so you've got this pattern. The pattern has placeholders in it. Those placeholders could be pub keys. But this then encumbers the next output to say, okay, the next output has to have a script that matches this pattern. So this checks the value, for instance. This lets you encumber the value. Also lets you check the pattern, which implicitly lets you check the pub keys or any other logical structure in the output script. Personally, I think this is kind of complicated. This is kind of a Ethereum-like approach to computation, right? Put everything on the stack, write a program to do it. This is very much not the kind of Bitcoin way of doing things. You know, one way to describe the difference between Bitcoin and Ethereum is Bitcoin requires proof of correct computation for scripts. Ethereum actually does the computation on chain, right? So, you know, my preference, I think the Bitcoin community's preference is rather than doing a lot of computation in these scripts, which has, you know, scaling consequences and privacy consequences, to do the simplest thing you can possibly do to prove that you did the correct computation. At the end of the day, you can do almost anything by just having a signature. So this is the first one. The second one is one I came up with. So the idea is the following. When you give someone a deposit address, instead of giving them a address to which you have the private key, you randomly generate a private key at the time they request a deposit, a new key. Then you create and pre-sign a transaction that does the vault to unlocked send. There's a one input, one output. Then you delete this key. And as long as that key got deleted, I've just created an enforcement where the funds have to move from this vault to the unlocked, because that's the only thing that exists at that point, is this one pre-signed transaction. And then I can give that address to Alice and let her deposit to the incoming address on that pre-signed transaction. This pre-signed transaction, unfortunately, depends upon the input transaction IDs. So we have to wait for Alice to broadcast her transaction before we can do this. So this private key has to live for some time while we're waiting for Alice to actually send the transaction. And that's a pretty big risk that during that time it gets stolen. And we can talk about secure hardware and all this kind of stuff. But this is a risk on its own. And if somebody is able to figure out how to obtain this private key, they can evade the vault mechanism entirely, which is not what we want. So instead of exfiltrating the private keys for the cold storage, they would just exfiltrate this set of keys, these pre-signing keys, and this would completely evade our vault mechanism. So there's a second idea here, and that is you create what I call a P2TST. So this is a pay to time lock signed transaction, is what a P2TST is. So basically what happens with this kind of construct is that your storage, your fund storage, is now a set of pre-signed transactions instead of being keys. You have keys also, but your main control is this set of pre-signed transactions. And then we can ask about what do I do with these transactions, where do I put them, and things like that. The second idea is instead of creating a key and deleting it, create a signature using a random number generator, right? And then through the magic of ECDSA key recovery, you can actually compute the corresponding pub key. And when I do that, I never had the private key in the first place. And I would have to break the ECDSA discrete log assumption in order to compute that private key. But by doing this, I have created this pre-signed transaction. It's a valid transaction. And I've enforced this policy now, having never had a private key at all. Now there are some caveats to this. This requires a couple of changes to Bitcoin. Either SIG-hash no input, also with this flag, and you need to be able to do pub key recovery. So I'm going to talk in a few slides about Schnorr signatures and the implications for that. The second piece of funny business about this second idea is that because the SIG hash depends on the input transaction ID, which in turn depends upon the previous transaction's output address, which in turn depends upon the pub key, I have a circular dependency on the pub key here, where I couldn't actually do this unless I can break my hash function. So I can't compute this pub key and then put it into this input hash, which depended upon it in the first place. And the way that works, do I want to do this one next? Hold on a second, let me go through my slides here and see what I wanted. So the way that works is when you compute the elliptic curve recovery, when you do EC recovery on the pub key, you have essentially three things in there. You've got a signature, you've got a public key, and you've got a message. So those are the three things involved in verifying a signature, right? The message that here, so the pub key and the signature, probably pretty obvious to everybody. The message here that's used is what's called the SIG hash. So this is what a SIG hash is in Bitcoin. It is a concatenation of a whole bunch of data extracted from the transaction. So it depends upon the version, the previous outputs, the sequence number, out points, which is all of your output transaction IDs, or output addresses, and various other things. So what we want to do here is not have to depend upon the pub key in the input, because that creates this circular dependency where I couldn't actually do this elliptic curve recovery. And so there's a proposal out there called SIG-hash no input, and SIG-hash no input was originally intended for the Lightning Network, where on the Lightning Network I want to take the set of inputs to my Lightning channel and be able to rearrange them without making an on-chain transaction. But if my transactions commit to the transaction IDs on-chain, then I can't do that. So what SIG-hash no input does is it actually decouples your Lightning channel transaction from those inputs, allowing you to rearrange the inputs, and therefore add more funds to a channel or remove funds from a channel without making on-blockchain transactions. So this is an important piece of technology that's basically going to come because of the Lightning Network. So can we repurpose it for this? Brief interlude on Schnorr signatures on this. So elliptic curve pub key recovery is well known in Ethereum. There's even an opcode which does it, or a common function. The way you check signatures is in Ethereum is often you just compute the pub key and see if it's the same. So there is now a Schnorr Bitcoin improvement proposal that's put out by Peter Wille. And the way it works is the following. This here basically is the equation he proposes that is satisfied by signatures in Schnorr, using Schnorr signatures. So Schnorr signatures basically, for those of you who don't know the history, actually predate ECDSA signatures. But unfortunately they were patented. And basically because of that, they never saw any use whatsoever. And at the time Satoshi wrote Bitcoin, about end of 2008, 2009, was almost the same time as actually the patent expired. I think it expired in 2009 or 2010. But because there was absolutely no history and no libraries which did Schnorr signatures, nobody used them. Schnorr signatures have a lot of advantages compared to ECDSA signatures. In particular, you can aggregate them. So if you take two pub keys and two signatures, you can add them together. And the sum of the signatures validates with the sum of the pub keys. And this is very powerful for blockchains because they have scalability problems in the first place. So if I can just smash all the signatures together into one big signature and validate one signature, this is a very big win for scalability. There's a lot of other really fancy things you can do with Schnorr signatures. They are linear, so you can add things to them. You can do native multi-sig inside of a Schnorr signature. So there's a lot of reasons that people want this, and a BIP has now been proposed. The mechanism to get it into Bitcoin has not been proposed yet, but the Schnorr BIP basically is describing how you do the signatures, how you check it, and things like that. So assuming this is part of the soft fork that comes to Bitcoin later this year, this still has the problem of committing to the pub key and creating this circular dependency that I can't actually satisfy. And the way that happens here is that they have intentionally put the pub key inside this hash. And the reason for that is that they don't want people to be able to reuse signatures. The standard way of specifying a Schnorr signature is this equation, which is almost the same except I removed the pub key here. Now, just for clarity, G is the standard base point. S and R are the two components of my signature. H is a hash of the R point, pub key, and the message again being sig hash, times my pub key. So with this original proposal, you can do pub key recovery. I can just put the other things on the other side of the equation and compute the pub key, which is what I need for this pre-signed transaction idea. And the reason that this formula was not chosen instead of in favor of this one was because I can actually convert a signature, any RS, to a signature on something else by shifting the S by an elliptic curve point, which is A times the hash of this R concatenated with M. Which means I can basically I can take a signature off the blockchain and reuse it for a different transaction. Now that's bad, because that might allow someone else to essentially send funds in a way that you didn't want them to. In other words, if I take this signature here, I shift it by this much, this is now a valid signature for this pub key plus A times G. So whether this is okay reduces to the question, are there transactions with exactly the same M? Because the one thing that didn't change here was M, which is the sig hash. And it turns out, in general, yes, there are. So one way this might happen is, so if you have a service provider has somebody sending them a lot of funds, it's basically standard practice to two different things. People often will do a penny test. So they'll send a very small amount of funds first just to check whether the whole system works. And the second thing they will often do is tranche things. In other words, they will take a large transfer and divide it up into several smaller transfers in order to lower the risk on the entire transfer. If you're sending $1 billion and you send it all at once and it's all lost, that sucks. If I'm divided up into 10 individual transfers and I lose 1/10 of it, that sucks less. But the consequence of this is that you will end up having transactions with exactly the same value and exactly the same address. So as much as we would want to say, hey client, please don't reuse these addresses, please don't send to the same address twice, which is standard practice in Bitcoin, we can't prevent them from doing it. And there are good reasons why they probably would. Now, those transactions, if I take two different transactions and I tranche it, let's say I send 100 Bitcoin to the same address twice, right? This is the case where I can reuse this signature. So if we then move those funds, let's say to another cold wallet or something like that, that second transaction is now vulnerable. And they can take the signature off the first transaction and apply it to the second with some tweaks and perhaps do some monkey business with our operation. Now we don't want that. And the reason that works is because of this sig hash no input. So if we were to use sig hash no input, which removes the input pieces from the sig hash, so 2, 3, and 4, which is the previous output sequence and the out point of the previous transaction, removes those by making them 0. That is a circumstance under which that signature replay would work. If we don't use sig hash no input, this is not a problem. So I had a half-baked idea this morning to try and fix this. So there's probably something wrong with this. Maybe people in the room will figure it out before we get to the end of the seminar. But I'll say it anyway. So the reason we ended up with a circular dependency was because the pub key is actually in the transaction ID. So the transaction ID in Bitcoin is the following. It's the double SHA-256 of the version, inputs, outputs, and the lock time. SegWit also defines another transaction ID, which is used in the Merkle tree of the witness block, and that adds a few more things, including the witness program. And what SegWit does is it takes a bunch of the usual transaction data and moves it to a separate block. And by doing this, they remove the possibility of malleability. Signatures in particular and scripts get moved to this extra block of data. So that leaves the transaction ID like this, and there's this other Merkle tree of the witness block, basically, that gets committed to. The TX outs here are where the problem is. These are a concatenation of all your outputs, value followed by script pub key. Script pub key for, let's say, a pay to pub key hash is a couple opcodes, and then your pub key hash. This is, for example, a pay to pub key hash. And this is where the problem is, because this gets hashed into the transaction ID, which was an input for my transaction, which I was trying to use to derive the pub key. SegWit has the same problem. It's a different mechanism there, but the SegWit script pub key looks like this. I have the double SHA-256 of the witness script. The witness script is essentially the same thing as this here. So this references our pub key. This hash is used in the sig hash, which is used to compute the pub key, creating a circular dependency. So what if we instead, this is the half-baked idea I had this morning, define instead an input-only transaction ID. So I'm going to take this original transaction ID, I'm just going to remove the outputs. So this now only involves the inputs, version and lock time as before. And if I use this to reference which inputs I'm actually spending, this would still uniquely identify the inputs I'm spending. Doesn't say anything about the outputs, but uniquely identifies the inputs. The outputs are tied to the inputs through the signatures in a transaction. Because sig hash, if you desire it to, the sig hash in the transactions ties them together. And then the outputs are then here in the witness tree. So I still have, everything is still committed to in the right way in a block. And I don't think there's a problem with that. But this would essentially solve that problem and allow us to actually compute the pub key and create pre-signed transactions without actually having the private key. This is a bit complicated. I literally had this idea this morning, so this is a bit complicated because you would have to kind of change the transaction ID index. One way of looking at Bitcoin is it's a big list of transaction IDs, right? If I want to change that index, I basically have to double my indices. This will not go over well, I suspect. Also, you might think that having a transaction ID without outputs was somehow analogous to having a transaction without inputs. I don't think this is actually useful for Lightning's use case, where they need the ability to change the inputs, because our transactions would still commit to the inputs. They just wouldn't commit to those inputs outputs. And where Lightning wants to do is be able to change the inputs. And this evades the problem even in the source signature replay, since the message is different for each input. Anyway, half-baked idea. Maybe it doesn't work. So a few more words about this entire idea. So again, your wallet is a set of pre-signed transactions. And I think these are kind of an interesting object for risk management, because these objects are not funds in and of themselves, right? There's a private key somewhere that is needed to do anything with them. But they can be aggregated into collections of known denomination. Let's call them like gold bars, right? So if I want to make a list of transactions, each of which is 100 Bitcoin each, and then I want to segregate them so that not too many of them are available in one place. It gives you an extra tool for your risk management. These objects, these pre-signed transactions, are less risky than keys and less expensive to create than key ceremonies. So a key ceremony for the kind of operation we're running is a multi-million-dollar affair that's audited and has all kinds of controls around it to make sure we don't mess up. These objects cannot be directly stolen, right? If I stole these pre-signed transactions, I don't have access to the funds. I also have to steal the keys with them. So you could back these up. You could put them with a lawyer or a custodian or something like that. There are downsides to this entire idea. A responsible hard fork, which implements replay protection, basically cannot be claimed. Because if I change how transactions are signed, or I change the address format, which you should do if you're making a hard fork, these pre-signed transactions will not be valid on the fork. And this, I think this is a good thing. I think forks are a waste of time, and people should stop doing that. But this is kind of a, some people would say nasty consequence of it. The deleting a key idea, there's what I've found talking to people around Fidelity is that deleting keys is generally not done. Our cybersecurity guys generally tend to back everything up just in case. You never know. Put in a really, really deep vault. The biggest problem with that idea is, how do you know if you really deleted a key? Both software and hardware attacks could evade the vault mechanism entirely. The philosophy around sig hash no input is that it's generally unsafe for wallet use in general. Don't use it for wallets. The reason it's okay for Lightning is because Lightning is a protocol that has certain rules around it and only allows you to use sig hash no input in certain places. It's not that people are sending arbitrary funds at arbitrary times to arbitrary Lightning addresses. You have to follow this Lightning protocol. And so that's why we run into this problem with penny tests and transferring tranches. Whether or not we create tranches is the sender's decision in policy, not the receiver's here. And that's kind of the source of the problem. How am I doing on time? All right, so there are two more ideas here. So push TX data, this was proposed by Johnson Lau. It is kind of a Swiss Army knife type opcode. What it does is it takes the random data from the transaction and puts it on the stack, which lets you then do a computation on it. Input index, size, output value, fee, log time, et cetera, et cetera. So this was proposed, I think even before Ayal et al.'s paper, but it's kind of gone nowhere. This is a draft BIP that never became an actual BIP. I think, kind of given the philosophy of let's not do all kinds of computation in scripts, this is probably not going to go anywhere. Lastly, probably the one I am most in favor of the other three, which involve opcodes which do kind of computation, would be this one, op check sig from stack. And the way a vault works with this opcode looks like the following. You've got, so up over op SHA-56 of your pub key, and then you do some stack manipulation, and then you do two check sig verifies. The idea here is that I'm going to put the initial stack here when I send the transaction will have the signature and the hash of the transaction data. The idea being that I'm going to do two signature checks, one of which is checking the signature that's on the stack, the second of which is checking the signature of the transaction. And if the signature of the transaction is exactly equal to the one that's on the stack, then that implies that this transaction data is exactly the same as this transaction. So it's implicitly verifying that this transaction has a particular structure encoded in its sig hash. It's generally possible to create recursive covenants with this. You can create, once you put this opcode in that actually encumbers the script of a next transaction, you can require that next transaction have any structure at all, and including you can require that it have another check sig from stack or push TX data or check output in there. There may be uses for that. Another kind of drawback of using these kind of opcodes is that it's fairly obvious to everyone what you're doing. All your code ends up on the blockchain. And so anybody can look at that and say, oh, I know they're using vaults. And that information is revealed with every transaction, not just the ones where you have to execute the callback mechanism. Any regular send reveals this structure. So it would be really awesome, I'll skip over that one for a second. It would be really awesome if there was a way to hide the fact that I was doing this. It might be, you might say that it's beneficial to tell people you're doing this because this would discourage thefts. But on the other hand, you're actually revealing the script itself and the logic by which this gets executed. And you're revealing things like, oh, well, it's a 2 of 2 multisig that's required to do the clawback. And you're telling the thief, okay, you've got 2 keys to steal. Now you got to figure out where they are. So it would be really good to just hide this entire thing entirely so that you can't see it. So there's another feature that's probably coming to Bitcoin in the next soft fork called Taproot. So Taproot was proposed, I think, about early 2018 by Greg Maxwell. And the way it works is you add alternative spending paths to your script. And you do it by taking your public key and you tweak it. And tweaking here means addition. You shift your public key by m times the base point g. So m is the Merkle root of a Merkle abstract syntax tree of alternatives. Just real quick, for those of you not familiar with a Merkle abstract syntax tree, a MAST, or a Merkle abstract syntax tree, is basically where you take a big block of if-elses and you turn it into a tree. So this would be a tree with 2 branches. One is the if and one is the else. And you just hash those 2 together and get a Merkle root from it. And so that's the Merkle root I'm talking about here. You're just turning a big if-else block into a single tree. So with Taproot, what one does is you shift your public key by this Merkle root so that you can later reveal that you actually have this Merkle root in there somewhere and reveal these extra spending paths. Okay, I'm almost done. So if you have a private key, you can sign for this public key just as you could for the regular key P by also tweaking your private key in the same way. And when you reveal, when you're spending, you can reveal these committed alternatives M in the script pub key, along with which branch of this Merkle tree you executed. Now, the interesting thing about this is that no one can tell that you did this. This looks just like another pub key. So nobody knows that you did this piece if you don't reveal it. And you can't reveal it unless you actually did it, right? So I can't take an arbitrary pub key and claim that I did this when I didn't. That would be equivalent to breaking the discrete log problem on BCDSA. So this is good for optimistic protocols, right? Where I have the alternatives are less frequently used in the default case. The transactions are indistinguishable from a standard pay-to-pub key type output. And you can hide all kinds of stuff. With Schnorr signatures, you can actually do multisig in a single pay-to-pub key hash type of output. And in addition, I can add this, which lets me do alternative things alternative to my multisig. So this is pretty darn fancy. And I'm very excited for this. This would completely let you hide that you did this. And your stuff ends up looking very simple if you did this. For your vault, your default script would be just the time log plus a check sig. All right. One more point on this. You generally want to add fee wallets when you do this, because if you create these pre-signed transactions or you use these kind of opcodes, this encumbrance that you create doesn't know anything about the fee market. Bitcoin and Ethereum and most blockchains have some form of fee market where fees will go up and down depending on block size pressure and various other concerns. And the time at which you actually claim these funds or use them for a withdrawal is separated in time from when you receive them. And the fee market generally will not be the same. So another monkey wrench in doing this kind of idea is that you have to generally add a wallet which is capable of bumping the fees. There are many mechanisms to do that. I won't go into them, but it's a consequence of doing this. All right, so let me wrap up here. So vaults are a powerful tool for secure custody that have been around for at least 2-3 years and haven't kind of really gone anywhere. My kind of read of the ecosystem from everybody I've talked to is that most of the core devs thinks this is a good idea. But we haven't really done the work to get there. So I would like us to. Fidelity would probably use this if we could figure out how to do it, if we had the tools on the blockchain. Pre-signed transactions, modulo my input transaction ID idea, are kind of undesirable because did you delete the key? If you're using no input, third parties can replay your signature, and so it's been constructed so this can't happen now. But they have very nice properties. I still really like this idea if we could figure out a way to do it, because of the risk management you can do with these pre-signed transaction objects. If I want to back them up or throw some with a custodian or do whatever I want. This slide originally said, I think we had a new idea. I had one this morning. Maybe this input transaction ID is workable. I don't know. Of these new opcodes, the one I'm most in favor of is opchecksig from Stack. So this opcode is already deployed by the Liquid and Elements sidechain networks. It's also deployed on Bitcoin Cash. As far as I know, there are no issues with it. It's a very simple opcode. It just checks a signature, right? But you can implicitly create covenants this way. There are maybe other uses for this opcode. One of the ones proposed in the original covenants paper was you can do colored coins with this. So in other words, if I take one Bitcoin and I call it a colored coin, and I split it into other colored coins, you always have the problem in colored coin protocols that, well, what if that Bitcoin gets mixed with other coins and then returns to be an actual Bitcoin accidentally? So you can actually enforce that that does not happen using these kind of mechanisms. So that's one other potential use case for all three of these opcode-based mechanisms. One of the reasons I like checksig from Stack better is that it seems a lot simpler than these two opcodes. It's less Ethereum-like and more just prove to me that you got the right thing. All three of them enable recursive covenants, which may be something we should think about. If you can encumber something forever, like a colored coin, it ceases to be a Bitcoin at that point. It's no longer fungible with Bitcoins. Is that desirable? In all cases here, batching is difficult. That's one consequence of this. You generally can't take these pre-signed transactions or these encumbered transactions and combine them with other inputs and outputs, because the signatures will sign over the whole transaction. There are ways to do it such that you only sign one of the inputs and one of the outputs. There's a sig hash flag to do that. But even if I do that, then if I batch a bunch of transactions together, I don't really gain a whole lot from doing the batching. So this is something I think that needs some more thought as well in this entire topic. That's it.